fun.
Most entrepreneurs miss out on opportunities due to lack of leadership or not knowing how to connect with the right people. They struggle keeping their sales pipeline full and booking qualified leads. On Business Leaders Network, you will learn from experts who will give you tactical tools and strategies to help you grow as a leader and how to keep your sales pipeline full, increasing your bottom line. Now, here is your host of Business Leaders Network with your strategic business success coach, J.R. Spear.
Hey, welcome everyone. My name is JR, and we are live with another amazing episode on our Business Leaders Network. And every week we go live where we teach you guys on leadership, sales, marketing, systems, processes, finances, something that we can help you guys walk away with tactical strategies that can help you guys grow your small business. So if you guys are listening, I would love for you guys to take some notes, take it seriously, and implement everything that we are about to learn. So also, if you have not joined our Business Leaders Networking community, every week we have training calls, networking calls where you can connect with other industry leaders that can help you guys grow. Go to blncommunity.com. That's blncommunity.com. And you can click on Get Started to join us on one of our weekly training calls. We have calls 3 days a week, no, 4 days a week now. So we just added some more last week, but 4 days a week for you guys to get plugged in and get to know more about what we do. And then lastly, if you have not grabbed a copy of my book, The Success Guide to Building Your Coaching Empire, where I walk you through 4 non-negotiable tasks of what you need to do daily to build your guys' coaching empires. So just go to jrspear.com. That's jrspear.com. Grab a copy of your book. All right, today we have another awesome guest. His name's Pat D'Amico. Leadership experience. He has leadership experience, began at the early age, accelerating after his enlistment in the United States Army, and then while at Valley Forge Military Academy, where he rose to the rank of cadet commander of the college. And after his commissioning as an officer in the U.S. Army, Pat served in overseas deployments, leading soldiers in Panama, Cuba, and the Middle East. He achieved the rank of captain and received numerous recognitions for his leadership in both combat and humanitarian operations. So Pat, today we're talking all about addressing today's leadership gap epidemic. But before we dive into it, I want the audience to really know more about who you are as a person and what led you to where you're at today to be able to help amazing entrepreneurs, build their businesses.
Well, thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and I think my journey in this area really began in high school. I was fortunate to have some leadership opportunities in high school. At the same time, I'm always willing to admit that I was not an exceptional high school student from a grades perspective. So when I was graduating, my parents asked, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to college," which they found interesting because there wasn't really any money to send me. And so my solution was I enlisted in the Army. And at 17, my parents signed me away, and I went to basic training. And it was during that sort of early stint that I competed and was awarded an Army scholarship. So as a result of that, I went through an early commissioning program, which is what took me to Valley Forge Military College, which was a junior college. So after my plebe year there and into my sophomore year, I was appointed as cadet captain of the college. So had roughly around 140 or 50 cadets under my charge, full staff. And it was really, that experience for me really changed my life. I was fairly disciplined actually as a high school student, but Valley Forge gave me the opportunity to really explore my leadership potential and grow my leadership as much as you can when you're 18 years old and in charge of 150 other young men at the time. So made a lot of mistakes early at that time. From there, I completed my degree. I got my commission, completed my degree at Catholic University in DC, and then went on active duty. I was in the Military Police Corps and was assigned to a combat military police unit. So I often say, although the Army paid for college, they got a lot more out of me than I got out of them because it was an interesting time. It was the late 80s. So I deployed to Panama immediately after the invasion there and ran law enforcement activities for Panama City and some of the outlying areas. And then subsequently ended up deploying to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia originally during Operation Desert Shield, and then Desert Storm was in Iraq. And then after return from that deployment, immediately turned around and went to Cuba for the humanitarian crisis there during the Haitian migrant crisis. And then exited the military in 1993. So in 1993, I joined Johnson & Johnson in a sales role, and I've spent the last 30 years in the business sector. Now, 25 of those I spent in industry, in large organizations. So I spent 15 years at J&J, sales management, did a lot of sales operations time, and then left J&J for a startup, which I took a job as a VP of commercial operations. That organization was bought by Medtronic, which you may be familiar with. It's the largest medical device manufacturer in the world. And I did about 10 years or so at Medtronic. And at that point, those years were primarily spent in the area of learning and development and training. And so during that time, I went back to school, got my master's in education. And then what I knew was going to happen happened. I was living where I'm living now because the startup had been here, which is in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. And Medtronic came to me and said, "Hey, look, it's been great. You've been living remotely," and I was traveling a lot, so it didn't really matter. But they said it's time. You're going to have to move to Minneapolis for your next job. Nothing against Minneapolis, just wasn't something that my family and I were really interested in doing at the time. So it was at that point, JR, that I really faced sort of a dilemma. The question was, do I want to go to another big company and run a large learning organization? I turned 50. My father had passed, which was a big event in my life, and I decided, I really need to do something different. So it was at that point that I went out on my own and created my consulting organization, which is called About Face Development, and I've been doing this now for about 7 years. So I spend about 40% of my time facilitating programs in the area of advanced selling skills. So training advanced level sellers in enterprise selling, executive level selling. I spend about another 40% of my time focused on facilitating leadership and management development at all levels. So from prospective leaders all the way through the C-suite, and then about 20% of my time I spend one-on-one executive coaching. So I'm a certified executive coach from UC Berkeley, and that's pretty much brings us up to date.
Yeah, so that's quite the resume. But before we move on, I just want to say thank you so much for your service and your dedication to our country. As a veteran myself, I definitely know the sacrifice and the things that it takes to actually serve our country and help those that do the things that helps makes us free. And I'm always curious. I always like to ask the question to veterans: is what did you learn? What did you take away from the military that gave you the leadership skills today that you're able to implement into your everyday work life?
Well, that's first of all, thank you for your service as well. And that's a pretty big question. So a couple things I think I'd mention was one of the most interesting things that, and I'm using that term interesting to be fair, when I transitioned to the private sector was, as you may be aware, if you spend a 20-year career, for example, in the military, during that 20 years, you'll spend roughly as an officer about 3 full years of that 20 years solely focused on developing your leadership skill. And you'll do that in courses where you don't have another job. So you will be completely focused. So over the course of that time, whether that's anywhere from probably 3 months to as long as, for some of the more senior courses, 9 months long. I got to the private sector, and the first thing I noticed was that there's a lot less leadership development, if at all. And all of those development programs or courses, you have another job while you're in them. So you have other responsibilities. So there's a lot, I think the military does a great job of really focusing on developing leaders. It's what I really see lacking in the private sector and in corporations. And I primarily work with Fortune 100 organizations, so names that you'd be familiar with. So that was one of the things that I think I took away. The other that I think is, looking back, is different today, is that as a leader in the military, you're not only responsible for your folks' jobs, their day-to-day, preparing them or doing the jobs they do. You're really holistically responsible for the individual, and oftentimes that bleeds into their families. So, one of your soldiers bounces a check, you get a call. One of your soldiers having issues, at home, you get involved. And so I think that holistic approach to understanding and appreciating what motivates an individual and what some of the challenges are really play into that. And what's interesting is I see that also now as an executive coach. So very often when I'm coaching somebody in the C-suite, it's not unusual to be focusing our conversations on what's happening with them personally that's impacting their job performance versus just talking about their work. So it's a couple things that I kind of took away from that.
No, I love that. Now, what are some of the big problems that you're finding in the workforce when it comes to leadership?
Well, first and foremost, I would say is the lack of leadership and management development as a whole. That is really what I see as the epidemic today. You know, in a lot of surveys of senior executives, they're asked what is most important that you work on developing in your organization, and leadership and management development is almost always at the top of that list. Unfortunately, they're also asked what are the areas you're deficient in. And leadership and management development is also always at the top of that list. So, we do a great job in most organizations, or I should say most organizations that I work with and associate with that are clients of mine do a tremendous job of training folks to do their jobs, right? What are the tasks and the responsibilities they have? They do a great job there. But leadership and management always falls to the wayside, either due to budget, due to time, number of things we can get into what I hear. But to me, it's the challenge in this area is just the lack of development. And I think a lot of organizations, and it's funny because people will say this to me, clients will say this to me, and when it's coming out of their mouths, I can tell they know they don't believe it. They'll say, well, we hire folks who have been leaders, so they've been trained. Well, the reality is they're not being trained in most places. So you're getting them and you're saying, oh, well, they've been trained. No, they have experience, but they haven't necessarily been trained as leaders and managers.
All right. So why do you think that there's lack of leadership development and management training within an organization? Do you think it just people don't know how to actually lead and teach people or lead people, or they don't have the skill set, they don't know how, or it's just a lack of time, like they just don't have the time to do it. And so that's why they hire someone like you to come in here and do it. Where do you see like the biggest gap is?
Well, I think the gap is that there's a misperception that you can't track return on investment for the investment in leadership and management development. So when I'm talking to organizations and they're looking at their budgets and where they need to focus, a lot of times leadership and management development is on the list, but it falls off when it comes to budgetary constraints. And again, because they don't think there's a return on investment. Now, I would argue that because the reality is the number one reason individuals leave jobs, and this is since post-industrial revolution, this has always been the answer. Number one reason employees leave jobs is their direct manager. And so the reality is that the cost of an undesirable turnover is anywhere, for my clients, we estimate it's somewhere around $250,000. That's the cost of the hiring process, the training dollars that were spent that are lost, the retraining, the opportunity costs that are missed during that transition. So, I would argue that there's a tremendous cost to a lack of competency in leadership and management. But a lot of times it's hard for folks to really get behind that and see that.
Yeah. So a lot of really good things I want to unwind right here. So when it comes to like the leadership from a team, because you say like one of the biggest reason why people usually, leave is due to management. But where do you think that organizations will spend majority of the money? I'm assuming that most of the money comes from, you spend a lot more on recruiting, training, and things like that. Like you just said, over 250,000 to do this. Or is it best to try to equip and really train the people that you have there? Where do you usually start whenever you come into an organization and you're seeing like a high turnover rate within their employees? Where do you normally start in that process, and how do you fix that?
So it's a great question. When organizations come to me, it's one of the first questions I ask. Well, I guess I would start here. What I've learned over the years is that when a client comes to me and says, we have these problems and we think they're a result of this, about half the time that's actually what they're resulting from. So there's a need to sort of evaluate and figure out. So for instance, and this will resonate with you, when folks come to me and say, we have a negotiations problem, a lot of times it's a sales problem, not a negotiations problem, right? They haven't they haven't delivered or sold value to a client, and you have to sell value before you get to negotiations. It's very similar when it comes to leadership. They'll say, well, we have high turnover, and that's the result of we're not paying folks well enough, or we think we need to revamp the compensation plan, or are we competitive? And most of the time, when I head down the path of doing an organizational diagnostic, which is a pretty involved process, what comes out of that is a lack of leadership and management competency. And I see it in those diagnostics, because it's really a haves versus a have-nots, right? I'll talk to employees who are thrilled with their immediate manager. They've got somebody who's really sound, who's either developed good skill, or maybe they've been trained somewhere else. And then you have those who all they want to do is talk about how bad their management is. And those really start to reveal what the real challenges are.
Yeah, so many good things. And I want to come back and start talking about like some pitfalls that, once we get back from our break, some of the pitfalls that organizations usually suffer with, and what are the signs or the things that we need to look for to recognize that we need some help in our leadership development and managing skills, and then what are some steps that we can take to actually fix it. So how do we observe that we have a problem, and how do we fix the steps moving forward to actually that problem? So let's stay tuned. We'll come back here after a minute.
Most entrepreneurs miss out on opportunities due to lack of leadership or not knowing how to connect with the right people or the right customers. They struggle keeping their sales pipeline full and booking qualified leads. What would your business look like if you had a team to support you referring your ideal clients who are excited and ready to buy? Business Leaders Network is a mastermind networking community where we focus on education, learning from industry leaders, networking, and building real connections. You can learn more by visiting businessleadersnetworking.com or by tuning into our weekly show with your strategic business success coach, J.R. Spear, on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Mountain, 12 p.m. Pacific on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
Are you a subject matter expert? Are you here to share your expertise with an audience waiting to hear from you in only the way you can deliver? Are you ready to have your voice amplified across the airwaves? Inspired Choices Network has a global radio platform streaming to millions of people across the world. Professionally produced and supported by an accomplished team every day, you can broadcast from anywhere in the world, knowing your voice matters, and we ensure it is delivered with ease and efficiency. Eager to hear your message, the world awaits. Contact us today to become an Inspired Choices Network radio host. Email become a host at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com.
This is Business Leaders Network with J.R. Spear. To participate in the program, join the live studio audience in our chat room at inspiredchoicesnetwork.com. You can also send an email to grow@businessleadersnetworking.com. Now, back to the program.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. My name is Jay, and I'm your host of the Business Leaders Network. And every week we come live where we teach you guys on leadership, sales, marketing, systems, process, and finances. And I want to invite you guys to join us in one of our weekly networking training calls where we come to you and help connect you with other industry leaders to help you guys grow in one of these 6 pillars, as well as give you guys education that can help you guys grow your impact and your influence. So just go to blncommunity.com. That's blncommunity.com. Click on Get Started and join us on one of our weekly training calls. All right, today we have a special guest. His name is Pat. We're talking about on addressing today's leadership gap epidemic. And I asked a question before we went off that I really want to dive deeper into probably for the rest of the show is, one, how do, as an organization, as a company, how do we identify that we have a leadership or a leadership development managing type problem? And then what I would love to do is dive into what are the steps that we can do to actually fix this problem. So I'm assuming that when you go into an organization, you first address the problem, where are they lacking and things like that. But I can honestly say from working with a lot of entrepreneurs or conversations that I have that a lot of times people just don't even recognize that they have a problem. Everyone wants to point the finger at the other people. It's like they quit because of this. They quit because, whatever reason, or they're lazy. They don't want to work. They don't want to show up. They don't want to, whatever it is, but it's never me and the organization and us that's going in there and fixing it. So I know it takes a lot of humbleness and it takes a lot of pride to really say, hey, you know what? I want to get better and I want some help. But when you're diving in, you're doing this onboarding, questionnaire, and you're really figuring out like does the problem actually lay? How do we identify that we have a problem in the first place?
Well, great question, JR. And I think the first thing I would say is that identifying if you have a problem. I think from a management leadership standpoint, undesirable turnover is probably the first glaring thing you would see, right? Are you losing folks that you don't want to lose? And the reality is, and it's funny because I do a number of facilitated programs with organizations, and with managers, I will take a list of the 10 most common motivators of employees, and I will ask each of them to individually rank them, and then I will then gather that information and I'll put it up on a flip chart. And what immediately shocks people is money is never at the top of the list. It never is. And we all think it is. Everyone says, well, we're not paying enough. And the reality is, I mean, if you have a major compensation issue and you're not competitive at all, certainly. But the reality is individuals, money is not an emotional motivator. It's a rational motivator. The question is, okay, what do people do with that money? So that is never at the top of the list. So understanding what's motivating your employees is really key. But to go back, when I go into the organization and I do what I call a diagnostic, and I give my clients two options, and I make it very clear which one I prefer, right? One is I can do a survey, right? We can do an online survey. What does that give me? I can gather more information, but I do prefer to do live interviews. So instead of sending out 100 surveys, I might interview for an hour each, 30 people in the organization at all levels. And what I like about that is we do them over Zoom. I get to see the reactions. I get to delve into things. And normally after the first couple, I start to identify things, which allows me to delve more into them. But you said something really interesting before the break. You said, how do we observe? And what's interesting about that particular word is, are we observing? So that's one of the first things I will ask. So I will ask employees, how often is your manager or leader working with you, spending time with you, observing and checking in with you? And I'm going to tell you, JR, that to me has become the biggest challenge, I think, in organizations specifically related to leadership today. Why? Because I think as technology has advanced and has made us, without question, given us the ability to do more work, it's also created more work outside of the one-on-one interaction and the observation that is really needed to figure out, is this employee, do they know what they're doing? Do they know how to do it well? Are they learning from what they're doing? So a lot of times I will go to organizations and I'll say, and to give an example, this is work that I actually don't do, but I will recommend folks, this is budget that I'd love you to spend on me, but I'm not going to ask you to, is bring somebody in who will actually look at, what are your leaders and managers spending their time doing? And let's get an actual data, and let's get data down, list down of where are they spending their time. And very often what we find is when the leader says, I don't have time to spend with my people observing them, there's usually some truth to that. But the organization's got to now look at that data and say, what can we take off their plate that really allows them to observe their folks and really dig into, do they know what they're doing? They know how to do it, and how do we help them improve? Because that's such a challenge today. And we find duplication of work. We find just too many reports, just too much management time is being spent and not enough leadership time is spent. So that's one of the first things I help, an organization address is, hey, your managers, let's be honest, your success as a leader and manager is completely predicated on the ability of your team, the individuals in that team, to be successful. They've got to be able to do their jobs, but you've got to be able to observe them and help them grow and perform, right? I can't be a leader and a manager and succeed solely on my own skill. I've got to be able to coach, train, develop the people in my organization. They've got to be able, they've got to have good performance in order for me to succeed. So that's the first thing that, I pick up on right away in most organizations, is there's just too much time spent on managerial tasks that doesn't leave them enough time to actually lead.
That brings some interesting questions to my mind as you're speaking that, because I'm like, okay, why are they not observing? Why are they not spending time with their staff and their employees? Just all the big whys. It's like, okay, if you're hungry for your business and the growth of your business, don't you want to have a pulse on what's going on? Don't you want to help your team excel and to become better? And I don't know, it's just an interesting question that really comes to mind for me, because ideally, if you're wanting to build a successful business that has a culture that people love to be part of, then you'll be invested to want to grow it. And maybe there's some problems with it. Maybe it's not even just it stops at one spot, but maybe there's a bigger issue. I mean, do you know the reason? Or did they just not know?
Yeah, and I think one of those is, do they have the time? Is number one, right? Does senior leadership and does management of the organization understand and appreciate that they need that time? But then there's also, JR, that end one, which is, do they have the competency to actually develop these folks, right? Do they know how to coach? Do they know how to develop these individuals? Which gets right back in full circle to what we started the conversation on, which is what I spend the majority of my time doing.
Yeah, so I'm smiling and laughing because that's the answer I wanted you to give. I was like, the real answer is, are they even competent in what they're doing to even lead these people? And so, because most of the time we feel like we're great leaders. Like I personally had to humble myself recently, and I went to my business partner, my coach, and I was like, I feel like I'm a really great coach at what I do. I love teaching, I love helping people, but I'm coming to realize I don't know if I know how to lead people in a very specific area, because I failed at it so many times. Like where I expect, you brought up a comment before where you said we hire people that should already know how to do their job. We hire people with the exact expertise to be able to do it. And that's great and all, but they don't know your culture. They don't know your systems and processes. They don't know what does it take for you to actually do it. It's a different system. It's a different way of doing things, and they have to learn to and adapt to it. But you're right. A lot of times, and I'm at fault for it too, is I hire people, with them already expecting them to have that expertise to be able to do that. And so I want hands off. Like I want to hire someone that comes in and does it, because I don't have time to actually lead you and teach you and do all these other things. Or else I would go find someone and I would groom them up and I would train them and I would do all those different things. And it's a challenge. So you said exactly what I wanted to hear, but it's also, you're spitting in my face, telling me, like, okay, I need to make some changes. But before we go into that, you said something earlier about like why people don't stay, and it's never for money for the instance. I mean, to me, three things that came to mind, and a quote that we all hear before, but one, it always starts with vision. Like the best partnership the best partnership that's ever created is two different parties that believe and align in the same vision. So does the employee even align with the culture and the vision of where you're going in the first place? Because this is the second, the quote that I was mentioning is like, we will fight for money, but we will die for a cause. Yes. So if we really believed that money was the issue, we would fight for that. But people are going to stay because they believe in that cause. They believe in that vision. They believe in what we actually stand for when it comes to that. And so as you're speaking, I'm like going through all these things are going through my head. I'm like, man, there's a lot deeper thing. And it makes me really feel and challenged, where it's like, I need to talk more about vision. I need to talk about why we're doing what we're doing in the first place with what we have going on, because I can bring people on and they can stay for a period of time, and I can convince them. I'm a great sales guy. I can get them in. I can sell them on why they need to be part of my community or why they need to join my team or whatever it may be. But will they stay? And will they stay for 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now?
Yes. So you brought up quite a few things. I made some notes here, so I'll even go back a bit. So, although we know the number one reason people leave jobs is their manager, the reality is and again, that's, in the Industrial Revolution, it was safety, right? My grandfather worked at Bethlehem Steel, and my father and his brothers worked there, and they used to talk about, why they felt unions were great back then, because they kept them alive, right? We're in a very different circumstance today, but post the Industrial Revolution, people's managers was number one reason. Now, here's the reality. For decades, that was the number one answer. It wasn't even worth looking at the number two answer until probably around 5 years or so, where these surveys around why people leave jobs, the number two answer started to bubble up and became worth talking about. And there's some irony here, because the number two reason people leave jobs is a lack of development. And I think there's a misperception in the market that a lack of development, too often when I'm sharing this with senior teams, I get the comment of, well, that's because people in this generation want to get promoted too quickly. And I'll say, that may be a topic, but that's not what we're talking about here. Now, when I go back to 20 years ago, I ran recruiting for sales at Johnson & Johnson for the United States. And if I had interviewed somebody, JR, 20 years ago, and at the end of the interview, when you turn it over to the candidate and you say, do you have any questions? If somebody had asked me, well, what kind of development are you going to provide me in this role? I probably would have said, well, I'm not even interested in you. How dare you ask that question? But the reality is today, and it's not only the war for talent, but today people are interested in what are you going to do to develop me? So that plays into this whole need for development. But I'll also comment on when we were talking about hiring people and assuming they have management leadership. Let's talk for a second about how we promote from within. Oh, well, you're a great individual contributor. You've done a great job in your current role, so you're going to make a great manager. And that is one of the massive mistakes I see made, and I see organizations, even clients of mine who know better, right? I will have conversations and we'll be talking about expansion, and they'll say, we're creating 2 new management roles, and say, I'm looking at promoting this person and this person. And I'll be like, okay, we know that they're good performers as an individual contributor, but do we have any sense at all? Have we assessed at all their ability or their potential to be a good leader? And lo and behold, 6 months rolls back around and I'm getting a call going, hey, we're going to be replacing those folks because we really didn't assess and they're not good managers. So that raises that whole issue of a good individual contributor does not a great leader make, right? And so organizations have to be very careful about how are they evaluating the leadership potential before they make a decision to promote folks. And it's a mistake that's made far too often and far too much.
Yeah, a lot of really good things that you unpacked right there. We're going to get ready to go to our second break right now. But, when we get back, I would love to talk about the steps that we can take to help develop these leaders. But once we figure out like what the big problem is, observing, are we lack of development and all these other things, what are steps that as a leader, someone listening to this can take to actually start making change inside their business? And yes, we know the answer is let's just hire Pat. But, but what are some things that someone can listen and take away? Be like, what? Here's some steps that we can do to help develop great leaders within our organization, so that way we don't have a high turnover, so we don't have ongoing issues that we continue to face. So love to dive into that, and we'll come back here after a brief moment.
Most entrepreneurs miss out on opportunities due to lack of leadership or not knowing how to connect with the right people or the right customers. They struggle keeping their sales pipeline full and booking qualified leads. What would your business look like if you had a team to support you referring your ideal clients who are excited and ready to buy? Business Leaders Network is a mastermind networking community where we focus on education, learning from industry leaders, networking, and building real connections. You can learn more by visiting businessleadersnetworking.com or by tuning into our weekly show with your strategic business success coach, J.R. Spear, on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Mountain, 12 p.m. Pacific on InspiredChoicesNetwork.com.
How wonderful would it be to carry your favorite Inspired Choices Network host with you throughout your day? Well, now you can. Inspired Choices Network now has its very own mobile app. Our free app offers live streaming shows, along with thousands of podcasts and TV episodes. Our shows cover a wide variety of topics. Whether you're waking up with us, carrying us through the day, and taking us to bed with you, we're always here for you to enjoy. We're easy to find. Just search for Inspired Choices Network in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store.
This is Business Leaders Network with J.R. Spear. To participate in the program, join the live studio audience in our chat room at InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. You can also send an email to grow@businessleadersnetworking.com. Now, back to the program.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. My name is JR, and I'm your host on the Business Leaders Network, and we are here to give you guys tools and strategies that can help you guys grow in leadership, sales, marketing, systems, process, and finances. And if you have not joined us in one of our weekly training calls, I would love to invite you to our weekly training calls where we have 4 days a week, networking calls, training calls, and great ways to connect and grow your network in your pipeline. Just go to blncommunity.com. That's blncommunity.com and click on Get Started. All right, we have Pat here today, and we're talking about leadership development in organizations. And if you missed the first part of the show, we are really talking about the signs, the steps that that it takes to really discover where we have a problem in leadership. And the first one we said was like, you got to recognize that you're having high turnover. When you have a high turnover, that probably shows that you have some sort of leadership development problem. And then we talked about like the lack of observing. So people like leaders within a company, they're not observing, what's going on within their employees, within their organization, what's going on within, the doors, inside of the doors, the walls of what's going on with their company. And then we talk about lack of development. So we observe it, but then also lack of development and really training these leaders, and where that's a big issue because we're not taking the time as the leadership, as the managers of a company to really develop our leaders. So if you missed the first part of the show, I want to encourage you guys, go back, listen to it, take some notes, because here's some really cool things that may be some eye awakening to you to really observe yourself, to say, hey, you know what, I have a problem and I need some help. And I asked Pat that when we come back that we'll talk about right now of what are some steps that you guys can take as leaders in your organization to help fix some of these problems. So Pat, we just uncovered those 3 different things: turnover, observation, and lack of development. What are some steps that we can do that can help make some change and we can implement today to start making a difference?
Good question. So first thing, Jerry, I'd say is and I know we mentioned this, but the organization, especially the leadership of the organization, has to first admit that they have a competency gap, right? They have to admit, hey, we have these issues, and these issues are a result of a lack of management and leadership competency. And then subsequent to that, be willing to commit to changing that, be willing to commit to identifying that, what the gaps are, and really developing that. I think the second thing is then to remove the barriers, right? Do our folks have the time they need just at a high level to develop their leadership and management skill? And it's interesting because a lot of times with organizations, and other consultants might argue this point with me, but I feel pretty confident on it. One of the things I'll ask during the early stages of working with a client is, how much time realistically can we carve out for these folks to develop, to commit to leadership and management development? Because very often they'll say, well, I think we need to commit 2 days every month to leadership and management development. And I typically look at them and go, hey, that's aspirational, but in my experience, that's not realistic. How much time can we commit? And we might land on 2 days of live training per quarter, and then in between remote sessions to either reinforce or to address things that don't have to be done in live training. So we have to be realistic about what's the time commitment that these folks can make, that the organization is willing to commit, that's realistic for them. I think the next thing is then to decide, okay, what does a formal program look like? And when I say formal, for me as a consultant, I deliver formal programs, but just what is a sound program that has cadence and rhythm over time? Because leadership development is a journey. I mean, I consider myself a student of leadership, and my leadership journey is never ending, right? Being a leader never ends. You're always developing. We go back to Harvard's definition of a true professional, which Harvard would say a professional is somebody who's always working on their game, who's always developing. So you got to keep that in mind. And then I think you need to identify what are those gaps that are greatest in the organization? And those do vary, right? Some organizations do a good job in certain areas, just as a matter of course, or because of the culture. There's certain things they do well. So it's never definitely not a one size fits all. So I think you need to keep that in mind. And then the other thing is, I can't stress enough the importance of identifying within the organization who are the really sound leaders. So we go to most organizations, you say, give me a list of the 5 folks in the organization, leaders of 5 leaders in the organization that everyone respects. You'll get a list. You will immediately get a list of those folks that are really successful, and leverage those folks. Because in my business, and I come from a background in learning and development, even within large organizations, you normally don't have the expertise in a training department per se. You don't have the expertise in leadership and management development. That expertise is spread across the organization, different individuals, different roles. And then set up, and I'm a big proponent of this, and even in formal programs I create in large organizations, cannot overstate the importance of peer-to-peer sharing. Get folks to share what's working, but also what's not working. What are the mistakes they're making? It's funny because I had written an article on this for Entrepreneur Online a few months ago. When I ask folks, what's it like when you make a mistake in your organization? The answers to that question tell me a lot about the culture, and they fall into 3 buckets, right? Bucket 1 is, oh my gosh, if I make a mistake, I hide it at all costs. We're a zero tolerance culture, and I don't want anybody to know. The second bucket is sort of I'll tell my leader, my manager, so they kind of know in case it comes back, but they'll do a good job of hiding it. And then the third bucket is those folks who will say, not only am I encouraged to share it with my manager, but I'm encouraged to share it with my peer group so that they can learn to not make the same mistakes. And there is a direct correlation, JR, in what I see in the culture and the success of the organization being those that are willing to share. So peer-to-peer sharing on a regular basis, because formal training, as we all know, is only a small portion of development in an organization. But the more you can bring peers together and share, this goes in all functions. I do this with executive level sales teams where I'm like, hey, let's get on the phone once a month. Somebody share, an executive level meeting they had, what worked, what didn't. People learn from that. And leadership is exactly the same. And it gives you a chance to bounce things off of everyone. And Berkeley did a nice job when I was in the executive coaching program there. They don't say what went wrong or what you could do better. They'll use this term of, what's an upgrade? So you ask the rest of the team, hey, you've all heard this story, you've heard this challenge, or they've told you what transpired. What might be an upgrade here? And that gives a chance for all these other leaders to share, hey, I've had a similar circumstance. I took this action. It worked out really well. So you cannot possibly overvalue the fact of sharing amongst each other really helps everyone grow. And I think that's really important. Having that culture of sharing and learning from peers is huge. Because the reality is this: no matter how well I get to know an organization, client of mine, I'm never going to be in that organization on a day-to-day basis. So my knowledge is never greater than the collective of the leaders. So having them get together and share, and I love to facilitate those sessions because I'll ask, hey, who's faced this challenge, and how does it work here, and what would you do in this org? I can give them some insight and some ideas, but then we'll talk about, say, does that work here, or how would you alter it to apply here? So that's really important.
No, a lot of really good things. And, I want to go back to the third one that you mentioned where you said, what does a formal program look like, and does it have sound cadence? Because I own multiple different businesses, and one of them that I do is I actually build programs for organizations and coaches and things like that, where we do everything from the video shoot to building the automation and set up their CRM and making sure that it's all very sync and works and fluid. And so for you, when it comes to creating a leadership development program, I'm very curious on your process and your steps of what you do with that. Like, do you teach them on how to do it in phases? Do you teach them on how to do it in like, okay, here's the first thing, the second thing? What does that look like?
So that's a great question. So when I left industry and went into consulting, I spent the first 9 months of that time looking at all of the research and history and data around leadership and management development programs over the last 50 years. And not surprisingly, there is actually a ton of data. There's academic data, there's industry data, there's hybrid, there's meta-analyses of these. And as a result of that, I looked at all of the competencies that academic and industry had sort of applied. And I started with a list of what was 300. So it was quite a process. And essentially, all that research narrowed down to 20 key leadership and management competencies. Now, what's interesting is they don't vary based on function or industry. Now, there are nuances to those in application, but the top 20 were, after doing all that research, really pretty clear. So I'll go to the organization and then we'll review those 20 competencies and I will ask them based on their feedback and then what I learned from my diagnostic, what are the priorities? Now I'm going to tell you that it's almost the first two are almost always the same across every organization. Number one and number two are always interviewing and hiring, right? If you don't have the skill to identify and hire the right people, you're dead in the water before you get started. So that's one of the top two. And the other one is coaching and developing people. Those are always the first two. So we'll look at, okay, what do we need to do to immediately address those two? But then we'll go through the rest of the competencies and we will essentially force rank them based on what they know about the organization, what I've learned, and we'll put together a long-term continuous development program. Because again, leadership and management is a continuous process. So we'll put together typically I'll start with a 20-month program in most organizations, right? That's those 20 competencies. And those things then just keep rolling because you have new leaders come into the organization that haven't been through it. You have leaders who have been promoted during that time who are now, that competency looks a little bit different at the second, third, fourth line management, level. So that's essentially how I cadence that. And then in that, we'll decide which of these competencies do we need to do live training. They're really critical. We need to get folks together. It's a couple days in person. Which of those do we want to drive reinforcement to? And then there's other competencies, JR, like I always use this example of meeting management. Now, meeting management as a leader is a key top 20 competency, but it's not something I need to get folks together live. So we'll deliver remote learning for that. So they might have access, my clients might have access to 4 or 5 micro learnings, videos that they can look at today, or maybe they don't have a meeting to schedule for another 3 or 6 months. They can always go back to that and it'll tell them, how do you logistically plan a meeting? How do you plan an agenda? How do you manage the speakers, right? So those things they can always call back to. So I think having a learning system as well that allows them to always refresh, both for the ones that are critical as well as the secondary ones that are important but not important enough to do live training are part of that. So that's a little bit about how I sort of plan the cadence.
What about the difference between doing virtual, like evergreen type training programs versus doing in-person training programs, and then also group or one-on-one?
So the pandemic taught us a lot. Really, I think that we're 15 years beyond where we would have been without the pandemic on this question of remote learning. So at the start of the pandemic, everyone was a captive audience. People weren't going to the office. They weren't calling on customers. So, immediately organizations would say, well, we need to do everything remote. And over the course of those couple of years, we learned a few things. Number one, tools like this advanced drastically during that time, right? Zoom, Teams became, so people's exposure all of a sudden was, oh, wow, these tools actually can really work when they would have nobody was considering them. Very few people utilizing them before the pandemic. So that was number one. Now, the initial reaction, first 3 to 6 months from clients was, oh my gosh, we're never going back to live training, in-person training. Well, sure, you're saving a ton of money on travel, saving a ton of money on catering and hotel rooms. But what we did realize was I started to look at which programs could work remotely, which ones didn't work remotely, and we made some adjustments. There were certainly some things that we had historically delivered in person that we were like, hey, we can do some of this remotely. I think the one biggest advantage of the pandemic is it helped solve one of the greatest challenges of training and learning, which was the challenge of reinforcement. Folks go to a program, they might pick up a ton of great things, they come home, they stick the binder on the shelf, and it never comes out again, right? What we learned is that reinforcement, and I think the data suggests 90 minutes is probably the sweet spot. I try to keep it to 60. I think 60 minutes to have people on and really, truly engaged in a reinforcement session is ideal. But I think 90 is okay too. But I think when you start getting beyond that, you start losing folks, and they have challenges with managing their jobs and their business. So I think that really helped us. But I think the pandemic taught us a lot about what works in person, what can work remotely. Some things, to be frank with you, some things we were doing remotely before, or my clients were doing remotely before the pandemic. We sort of relooked and said, you know what? We're not getting the bang for the buck out of this. We got to move this into a live session, and maybe we adjust some other things out.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering from what you're saying is, remote is definitely has its place, but we don't want to lose the in-person, especially from culture and community and just a camaraderie amongst others. I mean, being a veteran, we know the power of camaraderie and just being band of brothers and together is a big difference that you don't get virtual.
There's that. And there's also the question of skill development. Skill development is very hard. Role playing, skill development, case studies, very difficult to do remotely as effectively as you can do it in person. So I think those are critical. When you're doing practice, you're gonna get a better bang for the buck, and you're gonna get better engagement and greater development when you're doing skill development practice in person.
Yeah, I can probably have a whole nother episode on these different things. But one thing I wonder if you can hit on this one really quick. I've been part of the whatever you want to call it, the corporate world and sales, and I used to sell a lot of commercial equipment and material handling stuff and things like that. And they would do a quarterly event, not an event, but like a quarterly meeting where everyone came in, all the technicians, the salespeople, internal staff, and things like that. And it's like everyone was there just because they had to be there. But I can't tell you one person that was in that room that actually loved being there other than just the staff that put it on. Because they're like, oh, we get to go hang out and we get to get out of the office, get to do those things. But I think the biggest reason why, and I'm speaking from my personal experience, is there was absolutely zero value that was driven at those meetings. It was more just talking about core values and culture, which I understand is very important, but there's nothing that's going to develop me as a salesperson or develop me as a professional or entrepreneur or salesperson or whatever it may be. It was more just talking about the agenda of the company itself and why they have to be compliant, but not necessarily teaching me how to better my skill set of interviewing and hiring and coaching and communication and all these different things. So we only have like 3 minutes left. Are you able to hit on that like really quick in about 30 seconds? Because I want you to have a chance to be able to share how people can get in touch with you.
So I think that comes down to me to the difference. I consider myself a professional facilitator. I'm not a lecturer. I'm not an instructor. I'm not a teacher. I'm a facilitator. And that's what makes all the difference. I bring folks together. I share concepts. And then we talk about how do they apply in their business, and then we practice them. And that's when that individual gets value out of that time they spend, where they're seeing a direct connection to, okay, this is the concept, here's how it works in my business, now I'm going to practice it, or we're going to talk about it. Because again, I can know a lot about their business, but the collective of 25 folks in the room, I'm never going to match. So now we want to talk about, okay, how does this apply? Now let's practice. Let's bat this around and let's see some people demonstrate it. I think that's the real difference. Mike, your experience is probably more of lecturers, presenters. JR, I don't use any slides. I will teach a 2-3 day program and I do not use PowerPoint. It's not that I hate PowerPoint. It's that PowerPoint's not a facilitator, right? We give folks a workbook and they actually work in that book and they fill things in and they talk about it and we actually experience the training versus just looking at it.
That's really good. All right. So the last couple minutes, let's share about like who's your ideal client and who do you want to connect with?
So my ideal client are really, two in the area. First, in the area of leadership and management development, organizations that are, that are experiencing undesirable turnover, or that already know and have identified they have a gap in leadership competency. Those are the clients that I love to work with. Because I like to understand and help them identify what are the specific competencies they're lacking, and then let's put together a plan to really get at that over time. Clients that aren't ideal for me are clients that are looking for a one hit. Folks who are, I hate turning down business, but when folks come and say, hey, we've got this 4 hours at this meeting, can you come in? That's just not what I do. I want to create a relationship long-term where we have a plan because, again, leadership development is a journey that never ends. And then on the other side is executive coaching. I work with a handful of individuals at any given time, because I've learned over the years that you can't really do too many one-on-one executive coaching assignments because they are pretty demanding. But those folks as well, senior executives at the C-suite, often those are folks who are transitioning to the C-suite. So they're moving out of a primary tactical role to a strategic role, because that's a real challenge for folks. Those are some ideal clients.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for being here today. It was awesome to be able to learn and really grow. And I definitely took away some strategies that I want to implement inside of my business and organization. So appreciate you coming on here and look forward to
Thank you for listening to the Business Leaders Network show. J.R. Spear returns Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Mountain, 12 p.m. Pacific on the InspiredChoicesNetwork.com. Until then, stay committed to your goals and be resilient even through the most difficult times. Showing up every day, giving